It was an autumn night, one of those nights where darkness firmly embraces the earth, hiding secrets in the darkest corners. The road wound through dense forest, lit only by the headlights of David's car. He was driving alone that night, his only company being the sound of the rain that fell steadily. David was on his way to an important meeting, something he couldn't postpone. However, the storm raging outside made the journey dangerous and challenging. The wind shook the tall trees, creating eerie shadows that danced along the roadside. As he drove down the dark, winding road, a feeling of restlessness began to wash over David. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like he was being watched. He looked in the rearview mirror constantly, but all he saw was the empty road and the incessant rain. As the night progressed, David's thoughts began to wander. He remembered stories of haunted roads that he had heard when he was a child, tales told by friends with a mischievous smile on their lips. "Don't be foolish," he told himself. "It's just your imagination playing with you." But then, up ahead, something unusual happened. A figure appeared on the road, a figure that seemed to be standing in the middle of the torrential rain. David frowned and slowed the car, his eyes fixed on the figure as he approached. She was a woman, wearing a white dress that fluttered in the wind. Her long black hair was soaked with rain, and she looked completely out of place in the gloomy night. Her eyes were fixed on David's car, and she didn't move as he approached her. David's heart raced as he wondered who this woman was and why she was there, in the middle of the road, in that storm. He rolled down the car window and shouted, "Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond, just continued looking at him with empty, emotionless eyes. The rain fell on her, but it didn't seem to affect her. It was as if she wasn't really there. David swallowed hard and made a decision. He decided to stop the car to help the woman, worried that she might be in danger. But as he exited the vehicle and approached, something disturbing happened. The woman began to back away, floating backwards toward the dark forest that lined the road. Her eyes never left David, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He hesitated, a few meters away from her, when the rain seemed to stop just over her, creating a kind of protective dome. "Who are you? What do you want?" David asked, his voice shaking. The woman didn't respond, but her pale figure slowly disappeared into the darkness of the forest. David stood there, stunned, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The road was empty again, as if the woman had never been there. He walked back to the car, his heart still pounding. The uneasiness he had felt previously had now turned into a deep, dark fear. David knew that he would not be able to forget that meeting, and that the journey that night was far from smooth. David, still disturbed by the strange appearance of the woman in white on the road, continued his journey through the rain-soaked forest. The feeling of uneasiness accompanied him, but he was determined to understand what was happening. As he drove deeper into the forest, the road became increasingly narrow and winding. The tall trees cast menacing shadows over the path, and the headlights of David's car illuminated only a small portion of the darkness that surrounded him. The sounds of rain and wind were David's only company, until something unexpected happened. He began to hear a distant wail, a melancholy sound that seemed to echo throughout the forest. It was a sad, haunting sound that sent shivers down David's spine. The wailing continued, becoming louder and more disturbing with each passing moment. David couldn't identify the source of the sound, but he knew something was wrong. He tried to turn up the volume on the car radio to drown out the unsettling sound, but all he heard was static. Frustrated and worried, David decided to stop the car in hopes of understanding what was happening. He got out of the vehicle and stood on the side of the road, looking at the dark and silent forest around him. It was then that he heard the sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching in the darkness. David looked around, but he couldn't see anything other than the trees and the rain that was falling mercilessly. The sound of footsteps became louder, more defined, as if they were approaching quickly. A figure emerged from the darkness, slowly walking towards David. She was a woman wearing a white dress that was soaked with rain. Her long black hair was plastered to her pale face, and she had a empty and sad expression. David took a step back, his heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaking. The woman didn't respond, but continued to slowly approach. Her empty eyes seemed to look right through David, as if he weren't there. He was about to back away and go back to the car when something made her stop. The woman reached out toward David, her slender, pale fingers trembling in the damp air. She seemed to be begging for something, but her lack of verbal response made it impossible to understand her intentions. "Do you need help?" David asked hesitantly, reaching out his hand towards hers. The woman touched David's fingertips, and a feeling of intense cold ran through her hand. He felt a shiver run down his spine as the woman continued to look at him with her empty, sad eyes. Determined to help in some way, David got even closer to the woman, trying to understand what was happening. That's when he noticed that the rain falling on her didn't seem to touch her. She remained completely dry, as if protected by an invisible bubble. As David and the woman in white interacted, a sense of connection began to form within him. He felt that there was something deeper and more mysterious going on there, something that was beyond his understanding. It was then that the woman in white slowly backed away, as if she was satisfied with something. She looked at David gratefully, her eyes finally filling with emotion, and then disappeared into the darkness of the forest. David stood alone on the side of the road, his heart still pounding. He knew that this experience was just the beginning of something much bigger and darker. The night journey he had begun had turned into something he could not understand, but he was determined to discover the truth behind the mysterious appearances on the dark road. David continued his journey down the lonely road, but the vision of the ghostly woman continued to haunt his thoughts. The rain was still falling, creating an oppressive environment as he drove deeper into the forest. The road seemed endless, its winding curves taking him deeper and deeper into the darkness of the forest. The trees closed in on him, creating a kind of dark, damp tunnel. David knew he was no longer in control of his journey. It was as if the road itself was leading him. The murmurs of the forest grew in intensity, as if the trees and bushes were whispering dark secrets. David tried to turn on the car radio to shake off his growing fear, but all he got was static. He was completely isolated. It was then that he heard a strange sound, a distant and melancholic wail that echoed through the forest. The sound seemed to come from all directions, filling the car with a sense of sadness and despair. David tried to ignore it, but the lament continued to penetrate his mind. As he drove, the vision of the woman in white reappeared. She was standing on the side of the road, her pale figure illuminated by the car's headlights. David knew he couldn't keep ignoring her. He needed to understand what was happening. This time, when he stopped the car and approached her, the woman did not back away. Instead, she reached out toward him, as if she were asking for help. Her empty eyes seemed to beg for something that David couldn't understand. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice shaking. "Why are you here?" The woman didn't respond, but her empty eyes somehow conveyed a sense of deep sadness. David realized that she was not a threat, but rather a lost part of the strange story he was experiencing. Determined to discover the truth, David decided to follow the woman in white as she floated towards the forest. The rain seemed to create an invisible barrier around her, keeping her dry as the water fell around her. As they entered the forest, David noticed that the darkness deepened even more. The trees seemed twisted and distorted, as if they were trying to get closer to him. The wailing continued, becoming more distressing with each step. Finally, the woman in white stopped in front of an ancient tree, whose trunk was covered in moss and deep scars. She reached out toward the tree, as if she were making a silent request. David looked at the tree and saw that there was something carved into its trunk, a series of symbols and words in a language he didn't recognize. The woman looked at him urgently, as if she was waiting for him to understand. "What do you want me to do?" David asked, his voice echoing in the darkness. The woman in white did not respond, but her empty eyes filled with imaginary tears. David felt a wave of compassion and determination rise within him. He knew he needed help her, that this was the key to unraveling the dark mystery that surrounded him. Carefully, David began to touch the symbols carved into the tree, as if he were performing some ancient ritual. As he did so, the woman in white began to glow more brightly, as if she were being released from some invisible prison. The forest around them responded to the ritual, with the trees swaying gently and the murmurs turning into a soft, soothing melody. David felt he was unlocking a deep secret, a connection between the woman, the tree, and the forest itself. When the last symbol was played, the woman in white smiled at David, her eyes finally filling with life and gratitude. She bowed her head in thanks and then disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving David alone in the darkness. David's journey was still far from over, but he now understood that there was more than just darkness and fear on that sinister road. There were also secrets, connections, and mysteries to be uncovered. And, with the woman in white as his silent guide, he was determined to discover the hidden truth of that night's journey. David continued his journey down the dark, winding road, with the feeling that he was being guided by unknown forces. The appearance of the woman in white had left an indelible mark on his mind, and he was determined to find out what was going on. As he drove deeper into the forest, the rain continued to fall relentlessly, as if the world was crying. David felt like an intruder in that dark and mysterious environment, but his curiosity impelled him to continue. The road seemed to have no end, its winding curves taking him deeper and deeper into the darkness of the forest. The tall, gnarled trees cast menacing shadows across the path, and the melancholy sound of wailing continued to echo around them. David knew he needed to find answers, and the only clue he had was the appearance of the woman in white. He hoped that somehow she could reveal the truth behind the strange journey he was on. It was then that the woman in white appeared in front of him again, floating on the road like a silent specter. Her eyes, which were previously empty, now seemed to carry a message. David stopped the car and got out, determined to understand what she was trying to tell him. He looked into her eyes and asked, "What do you want from me?" The woman didn't respond with words, but reached out toward a nearby tree. David followed her gesture and saw that the same symbols that he had seen previously were carved into the bark of the tree. Understanding what he needed to do, David began touching the symbols on the tree, following a pattern that seemed to be engraved in his mind. As he did so, the woman in white began to glow brightly, as if she were breaking free from some invisible prison. The forest around them responded to the ritual, with the trees swaying gently and the wail turning into a soft, soothing melody. David felt he was unlocking a deep secret, a connection between the woman, the tree, and the forest itself. When the last symbol was played, the woman in white smiled at David, her eyes now filled with gratitude and excitement. She bowed her head in thanks and then disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving David alone once again. The sound of the wailing was gone, replaced by a calm serenity that hung in the air. David knew he had fulfilled his role in that mysterious story, but there were still unanswered questions. He got back into the car and continued driving down the road, which now seemed brighter and more welcoming. The storm had passed, and the darkness that surrounded him had dissipated. David's journey came to an end when he finally emerged from the forest and found himself back on a familiar road. Night had turned into morning, and the sun was beginning to rise above the horizon. David knew that the experience he had on that dark and mysterious road would never be forgotten. He would never fully understand what had happened, but he knew he had witnessed something supernatural and inexplicable. As he drove toward the new day, David knew that the eternal road and the apparitions in the forest were a mystery that would never be completely solved. But he also knew that that journey had changed him forever, leaving him with a deeper understanding of the unknown and unexplainable that permeates the world around us.